going to be taking most of our thoughts this morning from Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5. In Genesis chapter 5, we're going to find a genealogy. So, Lord being my helper, I'm going to preach to you this morning concerning this genealogy that stretches from Genesis chapter 4 to Genesis chapter 5. As you know, there are certain objections to genealogies found in the Scriptures. For instance, the first one we find is in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Paul writes, "As I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, that thou mightest charge some that teach no other doctrine. Neither give heed," he's instructing young preacher Timothy, says, "neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do." Also, again, he talks about genealogies over in Titus chapter 3 and verse 9. That's Titus chapter 3 and verse 9. Once again, Paul gives the admonition, "But avoid foolish questions and genealogies." He's not saying genealogies are necessarily foolish, or not, because he says, "But avoid foolish genealogies." Not genealogies, but foolish genealogies, and avoid foolish questions and contentions, sort of implying that there are certain contentions over the genealogies, and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and vain, which means empty. So, why the admonition by the Apostle Paul to a young preacher to avoid the pitfalls of arguing about not just genealogies, but endless genealogies, and also avoid talking about foolish genealogies? Well, the genealogies we'll find in the Bible are neither endless, they have a beginning and they have an end, and they also are not foolish as well. Now, the purpose of genealogies in the Bible, Old and New Testament, is to point us to the Messiah, to point us to Jesus Christ. There are other purposes for these genealogies, which we'll probably, hopefully, get into if the Lord will bless us. But why the admonition by the Apostle Paul? Well, for one thing, the Jews in the law couldn't keep away from the little things. Paul's telling them there are some major things you need to be focusing on, but instead the Jews in the law many times focused on the little things, and sometimes they turned into foolish contentions. We find over in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, it says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." So there is a law that says you must tithe, you must give a certain percent of all you own. So even if you had a little garden in the back of your house and you raised cumin and mint and anise in that garden, they're saying, we need to really use a weight scale and weight it out. How much mint do you have? And let's give 10%, to the temple. And they wasted a lot of their time on these little things that didn't matter that much, but there's weightier things, weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, not to leave the other undone. So there's little things we need to pay attention to, but there's bigger, major things we really need to pay attention to. So, but what about these genealogies? I read a history that Herod, and this, I don't know if this is true or not, but Herod went into the temple where they kept the documents of the written genealogies and had them burned up because he was tired of people tracing their genealogies and giving themselves, sort of royal title to things because of their birthright. He wanted to destroy that, you know. He didn't want anybody to be royal except him. And so the story goes that he destroyed these genealogies, and so the people had to sort of go by oral tradition, which, you know, from who said what, and sometimes that's not reliable, and maybe they had scraps of genealogies they put together. So people would argue about their genealogies. You know, I'm really the son of so-and-so. My great-great-granddaddy was so-and-so. It sort of reminds me of the arguments back, you know, during the times of Robert the Bruce in Scotland, when Scotland was seeking its independence. And all these different clan leaders had their documents that showed that they were in line for the throne when they came in. And I guess the famous joke was, you know, recognize these ancient documents to show my lineage to the throne of Scotland. And the other clan leader says, those documents were lies when you wrote them. So, and isn't it also reminded me of people that believe in reincarnation. You know, when people that believe in reincarnation never talk about their so-called ancestor that was a plumber. It was always their reincarnated, you know, relatives were kings and queens. It's funny how they're always famous. And so I think that may be part of it. You know, the Jews, you know, focused on the little things all the time and talking about endless genealogies. And then, you know, and if they didn't have a complete genealogies, you know, their relatives were always famous and always rich and always royalty. So Paul said, those are foolish. But as I said, the genealogies we find in the Bible are very important to us, extremely important to us. But they are made fun of, aren't they? They're made fun of when we talk about them usually, and sometimes they're made fun of on TV. You know, so-and-so lived and he died, and he had children. And so-and-so lived 800 years, and he died, and he had these children. And so-and-so, you know, people say, you know, that's a good thing. A genealogy may be a good thing to read when you're trying to go to sleep, right? But that's not the point. These genealogies are very important. The Old Testament and the New Testament both begin with genealogies. The genealogies we find in the beginning of the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 4 and 5. I haven't really touched on these genealogies before, and I'd like to talk about them this morning. And then we go all the way over to the New Testament, the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 says, and this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So most Old and New Testament begin with genealogies. As you read the Bible, you understand why genealogies are important if you actually read them. They all are going to point us to the Messiah, who is our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the Savior of all God's elect children. All right? Before we get to the genealogy over in Genesis chapter 5, though, it's important that we read a verse found in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. This proclamation, this prophecy, it's the proto-evangelium. It's the first gospel that we read in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the words are this: and I will put enemy, between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And so, I'm sorry. And it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Let's see. Let me read. It shall bruise, see, the seed of the woman. He's talking to Satan, right? He's saying, Satan, the seed of the woman shall bruise thy head, and you shall bruise his heel, right? So, this is the prophecy of the coming Messiah, right? And this was stated in the presence of Adam and Eve. And you know what happened? God was telling them this because they were going to be forced out of the garden. Adam and Eve are forced out of paradise, forced out of the garden. And so they can't get back into paradise. He puts cherubims, plural, in the way, and a flaming sword. If you look at that up in Hebrew, it means maybe an angelic sword. And these cherubims were fierce angelic beings. They weren't little chubby babies with little wings on their backs. These were, angels could kill hundreds and thousands by themselves. They were fierce beings, and God was serious by the fact that they were not going to get back into paradise because of Adam voluntarily violating the law of God. And they are both cursed. Mankind was cursed, and the earth was cursed. What was the curse to mankind? In the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So first of all, the genealogy tells us about the reign of death. He lived so-and-so. Now, you're going to find out people at the beginning lived extraordinarily long lives. Average age at the beginning of the earth, outside of the garden, is about 1,000 years. And that's significant, and we'll get to that. We'll get to why that's significant and important. But they eventually all died. They lived a long time. We'll talk about how, in fact, long people lived, especially Adam and Methuselah and Noah. They lived a long time, but they died. So-and-so begat so-and-so, then he died. So-and-so begat sons and daughters, then he died, and he died. When you read the genealogies in chapter 4 and chapter 5, you'll find 8 times where it says, and he died, 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 showing the penalty for sin is death. And death means separation from God. So humanity is now outside paradise. And we read in chapter 4, Genesis chapter 4, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. I have gotten a man from the Lord. And why did she state it that way? Because she believed, I think, in my opinion, she believed that Cain was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Genesis chapter 3:15, the seed of the woman, right? They're getting kicked out of paradise, and the destiny of man is to get back into paradise. What did God say? What did Jesus Christ say on the cross? He says, verily, verily, I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. See, but the destiny of man to get back to paradise after he was kicked out cannot occur unless the prophesied Messiah comes in order to deal the death blow to him that had the power of death and hell, and that is that old serpent, the devil, right? Okay, so Cain is born, and maybe he's the one. I've gotten a man from the Lord. But then what happens? Cain kills Abel, right? Well, Abel, as they're growing up, we see that Cain is a profane man. So maybe the focus, maybe Cain's the guy. But then as he grow up, this is a profane guy. She has another son named Abel. Well, maybe it's Abel. But then Cain kills Abel. So it's neither one of them, right? Can't be either one of them. So what are we going to do? So we go on Genesis chapter 4, and you go down to verse 25 in Genesis chapter 4, and it says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. There is now the genealogy beginning again. There's no genealogy of Cain. Well, there is a genealogy of Cain. In fact, if you read about his prodigy, it was something else. They were hunters. They were artisans. They they produce poetry, music, but they're also the builder of cities, you know. I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, I've been to the big cities. I don't want to live there. I don't want to live there. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But they did a lot of things. And I think that that went over to the other line. But the point is now there is a new line of genealogy, and it's from Seth. And to Seth, to him also, and Adam, go back to verse 25 of chapter 4. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth, for God said, she hath appointed me another seed, instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. There you go. And to Seth, to him also, there was born a son, and he called his name Enos, and then began man to call upon the name of the Lord. So we have this statement that surely looks like this is the beginning of prayer. You know, men didn't really have to pray in the garden. Why is that? Because God walked around with them in the garden. He was there. But now they're forced out of the garden. They're forced out of paradise, but they're also forced out of the very presence of God. And here, now there's communication reset, and it's through the vehicle of prayer. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. I'm sure there's more to that than that. So then chapter 5, we begin the genealogy of Seth. The genealogy of the promised seed, right? The family line of the Messiah. And that's what's important. And, you know, this is really shows you the magnificence, omnipotence of God, His providence, and the way He works things to His own pleasure, right? Maybe it's Cain. Maybe it's Abel. No, it's Seth. And we're going to see that it's not just coincidence that the Messiah was born here. It was God's purpose that the Messiah was born through this line. So through this genealogy that we're going to read in chapter 5, it's the seed that brings us to Messiah, the family line of the Messiah. But here's another reason why Genesis 5 and part of Genesis 4, the genealogy, are so important. Here's another reason it's so important. Because this is the only authentic history that we have. It's the only authentic history that we have between creation and the flood. Between the creation and the flood. We don't know very much about that except from this genealogy. We know nothing about history except what God has revealed to us from these two chapters. So the time from the creation of Adam and to the flood is calculated very carefully for us. We have the exact number of years. From the creation of Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. It's very exact. How do we calculate that? We calculate that because we track how long Adam lived. Adam lived until Lamech, and he was then 874 years old. And then from there, you just add the remainder of Methuselah, and you get, because he died the year of the flood, right? And then, so you backtrack that, and that's 1,656 years. So we have Adam all the way to Noah. And what's Noah? Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And where does the Messiah line come from Noah? Through which son? Comes from Shem. Shem is the father of the Jews and of the people from the east. So we have this line. So we have the line of Seth in chapter 4, Adam to Noah. So, and it tells us of the time that elapses from the creation to the flood, which is about 1,600 years. So, why is that important? Because it rules out evolution. It rules it out. It gives us specific amount of years. The Bible, this genealogy, tells Bible believers the age of the earth, the age of the universe, and the age of man. And guess what? It's all the same number. It's all the same number of years. So our conclusion from reading the genealogies in chapter 4 and 5 are not only to show us the path to find the Messiah and how God is so great and so powerful in ordering things according to his own pleasure, but also teaches us things like things that people had no idea would come up and be questioned, like the creation of the earth and the universe. Now, there's no evolution, 100%, no dispute, that's gone. Also, it tells us another thing. It tells us about the population of the earth, man. Remember that man was to go out and fill the earth. So how many people do you think were on the face of the earth at the time of the flood, when God destroyed all living beings except Noah, his wife, 3 sons, and their wives? How many people? Well, it couldn't be very many because the earth was quite young at that time. Well, I'm surprised to find that some estimates of the population of the earth at the time of the flood was about 7 billion people. Now, how much population we have on the earth right now? I looked it up. It's 7.8 billion. So the amount of people at the time of the flood, it might be, can't say this for sure, but it might be the same number of people that are living right now. Maybe that tells us that Jesus is coming back soon. Maybe that's a good thing, right? But how did they have so much population? Once again, I told you that the people, men and women lived, their average age was about 1,000 years back then. How many children can you have in 1,000 years? Well, we read that Enoch, who's a very special character in this genealogy, he has a son at 65 years of age. But how about Noah? Well, Noah had 3 sons. He had a lot more children than that. We read that he has, we read about him having 3 children at the age of 500 years old, right? So people were having children when they were 500 years old. We read that in the scriptures. Well, sometimes a lot older than that. So you can see, because of the age of people back then, that the population increased exponentially. Exponentially. Now, what's another purpose for this genealogy? We've already touched on it, but 8 times the phrase is used, and he died. And he died. So this genealogy tells us about the reign of death and the consequences of sin. And that's one thing it teaches us. But as we'll read this genealogy, amongst all this death, there is a wonderful glimmer of hope. Because there is one man that is listed in this genealogy who escapes death and divine judgment and goes on to be with the Lord. And we're going to find out we need this glimmer of hope. But the people back then, the people of God, needed that glimmer of hope as well. So you can trace Jesus Christ, trace him back through the lineage of Seth, right back to Adam. And then you can go to Seth and go from Seth all the way to Noah and his sons, and the one son, Shem, who would be the forerunner in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And then you can go all the way to the end and go all the way back to the beginning and trace Jesus Christ through all these people all the way to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. that he would bruise the head of Satan and he would destroy him that has the power of death. Isn't that wonderful? The prophecy of the Savior, the Messiah, and the Savior of all of God's children, all of his elect. So, let's sort of recap. This Genesis, this genealogy, tells us there wasn't millions and millions of years. There wasn't these things called natural selection that happened over millions and millions of years. I believe in parts of natural selection that's unavoidable. But I know it didn't happen over millions and millions of years. And this genealogy disproves mutation, the mutation theory of evolution. And he said, well, Brother Chris, that was just in one chapter of the book. Well, not so. Let's go over to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, the very first chapter. 1 Chronicles chapter 1. Let's read that together. So, as we get to this 1 Chronicles chapter 1, though, I want you to think about Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 tells us all these figures from Adam to Seth, all the way down to Noah. So 1 Chronicles chapter 1 says Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, I can't pronounce that correctly, but Jared, Henoth, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it goes on. Just those first 4 verses. So it gives us that genealogy, the same exact genealogy that's in Genesis chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 5. Well, that's the Old Testament, Brother Chris. Let's go to the New Testament. Go to Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. If you'd like to. But Luke chapter 3 and verse and we have the in Luke chapter 3 we have the genealogy again, but I'll spare you everything, but it lists the same people all the way down the line. Look at verse 38. Luke chapter 3, verse 38. Which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. So it goes backwards all the way to Adam. Notice it goes from Adam to Seth to Enos and all the way back to Noah. So it's the same genealogy in Genesis, 1 Chronicles, Luke chapter 3. So therefore, the time frames are correct as well, because we have listed the father's ages and the child's ages. Now also, one last one I'll give you, which was found in the book of Jude, only one chapter, and it comes right before the book of Revelations. Jude, we'll make comment about that a little later. But in Jude, verse 14, it says, and Enoch also, the 7th from Adam. So if you go that genealogy and you count backwards, Enoch is the 7th from Adam. He's the 7th person from Adam. It's the same in Genesis, 1 Chronicles, Luke chapter 3, and also over here in the book of Jude. So all genealogies have him in the 7th. So there's no gaps. There's no breaks. It's all continuous. And we have a definite number of years. Now, we talked about how long these people lived. And this will be significant to you. Adam lived a long time. Who was the person that was alive right before the flood? Wasn't that Methuselah? Methuselah. Do you know that Adam lived so long? He lived 200 years into the life of Methuselah. Methuselah lived 600 years into the life of Noah. So you have Adam, lived so long, he lived the same time as Methuselah, and Methuselah lived so long that he lived at the same time as Noah. Why is that important? That's important because there is only one man that bridges the time frame between Adam and Noah. At this time, I don't think there's anything written down that we know of. So, have you ever played that game of telephone? They do it with kids. You know, you whisper something in one kid's ear, and he passes it along to the other kid, whispers another kid, and gets around the circle and you ask the last kid, okay, what was the message? And the telephone message is just, completely different than when it first started, right? And that's the argument people make about the Bible. The Bible, it was just written, it was passed down by oral tradition, and people added to it, they subtracted to it, made it bigger, made it sound bigger than it was. Plus, there were so many people. It was like a game of telephone. It's going to get garbled, it's going to get confused, it's not accurate. Well, did you know that Adam was able to talk to Methuselah and tell him everything that happened in the garden? He was able to talk to all his people that came after him, his sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, great, into Methuselah, and was able to tell him how it all happened. Everything that was said, everything that was did. So Methuselah didn't hear about this by hearsay. He didn't hear about it by 20 people removed. He heard it, as it were, straight from the horse's mouth. And as Methuselah heard this, he was able to tell it to Noah. And Noah heard it from Methuselah. Now, why is that significant? Because we're going to find out that everybody died. Everybody died at the flood. Everybody died. There's no more people except for Noah and his 3 sons. And then we begin to get a written record. Now, I'm not saying that God is dependent upon the oral tradition of men. We're going to find out that's not true, because God gave special revelation to the writers of this holy book that we have before us. He gave them, they didn't need to have oral tradition, but I just wanted to point that out to show you how it was so many few people that passed this information on. God could give them special revelation, but it shows you how God worked this to the advantage of humanity and to the argument that God is all-powerful and he can preserve his word. We're going to find some things out about Enoch that we didn't find out in Genesis. That's not recorded, because God gave the writers in the New Testament revelation about these wonderful things that happened in the past. So, one man brings Adam to Noah and gives him the information. Methuselah knew firsthand what happened in the garden, and in this case, he got it from the person that was actually there. And he was the person that could actually pass information from Adam to Noah. And Noah overlapped Shem. No, Shem was who? Shem was the son of Noah. And Shem lived such a long time, that Abraham died before Shem died? So Shem was alive at the time of Abraham's travels, and at the time Abraham died, Shem is still alive. And maybe you've read that booklet. about the king of Melchizedek over in Hebrews chapter 7. Melchizedek was the king of Salem. He was also the priest of God. And Hebrews is telling us that Jesus Christ is a priest, but he's not a priest after the order of Levi or Aaron. That's the law. That's the law. Old law. That's the Old Testament. But Jesus Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, because Melchizedek says, if you read it in Hebrews chapter 7, he had no beginning and no end. Guess if you lived, the point of that booklet that I read about Melchizedek, if Melchizedek is indeed Shem, maybe not, but Shem, if he was alive, would seem immortal. Because as you know, on the other side of the flood, the ages of people started decreasing. People didn't age to 1,000 years anymore. They went down really rapidly. Till you see Abraham, he lived into his hundreds. So people kept on dying, kept on having children, and those children would die, and those children would have children, and they would die. But Shem's still alive. Shem seems almost immortal, maybe. But that just wanted to bring that out to show you how long God allowed people to live in order to prove his purpose. So we have Adam to Melchizedek to Shem, who's living during the time of Abraham. He outlives Abraham. So Shem actually lives till the time of Isaac and also Jacob. The people are paying tribute to this Melchizedek. And then we have this written down, and it's no longer oral tradition. So the bottom line is, from the Bible, it tells us the age of the earth and the universe and everything else probably started around 4000 BC, and now we're in 2000s. So we say the age of the earth is approximately 6,000 years. But the main point of the genealogy is not just to show us how old this universe is or how old this earth is. It's to point us to the Messiah and his birth. And his birth, we'll see how it was reconstructed, had to be by God's sovereign choice. It had to be by his providence. Do you believe in coincidence? You might say, yeah, I believe, yeah, coincidences happen all the time. But the problem is, when you start having too many coincidences, the coincidences cease to be coincidences, right? Just so happens that only one man fits the genealogy of the Messiah. And that man is Jesus Christ. I won't even go into the house of Judah line of genealogy, which shows that a curse was put on the royal line of David, and how God worked that to go around the curse in order for Jesus Christ to be born as the Messiah. So only one person fits the description of the Messiah genealogy-wise, and that's Jesus Christ. Only one man, Jesus Christ. And it just so happens this one man who fits this genealogy over thousands of years, just so happens this person can perform miracles. He can give sight to the blind, legs to the lame. He cleanses the lepers. He even raises the dead. And also, he's a preacher of righteousness. And it just so happens that this one man who fits the genealogy bill, that can perform the miracles and is a preacher of righteousness, says he is the Son of God. I'm that bread that came down from heaven. He says he is the Messiah. So therefore, it was such a slap in the God's face that the Jews would reject him as the Messiah. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 4. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 4 and 5. We'll go back to chapter 5. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man, and the likeness of God made he him." Right? And that's an apt description. Let us make man in our image. That's what the Trinity said. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. Creation of God. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness. Well, hold on. Stop. Adam, the man, humanity was created in the image of God. But here it says Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness. What does that mean? What's in the blood? Oh, I have royal blood. John chapter 1 says, it's not by, who your daddy is, but people say it's because who my daddy is. Righteousness does not run in the blood, but corruption does. Right? When Adam sinned, we became sinners, and all of us are sinners because of Adam. The line is corrupted. The bloodstream is corrupted. That's the reason he says when Adam had a son, it was in his likeness. Here the curse is passed on. It's passed on. Verse 4, and the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. What a blessing it is to be able to live so long. And verse 5, and all the days that Adam lived were 930 years. 930 years, and he died. And who's the next in line there? It's Seth. Seth lived 105 years, and he begat Enos. So we're starting the line. Adam, Seth, Enos. And God is gracious. But once again, this genealogy is also telling us about the reign of death. Adam lived until one generation before the flood. And just think about that. Why did God bring the flood? Why did he bring the flood? Because the thoughts and intents of the hearts of man was only evil continually. How would you like to live back then? You couldn't even go outside without fear of dying. People say that about New York City, but hey, New York City's a cakewalk compared to the earth before the flood. And Adam sinned before God, and that sin just grew and grew exponentially. So it must have grieved Adam so much, must have grieved him so much to see violence and sin filling the earth. And it just compounded him day after day. And I'm running out of time this morning, so I'll hasten on. But this grieved Adam. And we could read verses 6 through all the way through verse 24. But we see all these people coming in the line of Adam. But we say, start with verse 20. Genesis chapter 5, verse 20. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Verse 21. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. Methuselah, remember, died right there at the flood. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not. And he was not. That language just tells you he disappeared. He walked with God 300 years, then he was not, for God took him. And then we go on to Methuselah. When somebody says, it's sort of strange that we have all these people died, and he died, and he died, and he died. And then we get to Enoch, and he doesn't die. He's just goes with God. God takes him. He just disappears like a magician, he's gone. And why does God do that? Why does God do that? Well, his mind is infinite, mine is finite, so I don't know all the reasons. Never can know all the reasons. But here's just my personal opinion. I think God did that not just for Enoch, but he did that, as an act of compassion to Adam. Adam started this whole thing. The earth is filled with sin and violence because of his voluntary act of disobedience. And now he is seeing the consequences of that. As the earth gets darker and evil and more violent, and he sees this day after day. And he lived, how long? 930 years. I mean, some people, when they live 100, say, just Lord, take me. 100 years is too long. And as we get older, all of us, as we get older, we start to see how really sinful this world is. When you're younger, I didn't see it at all, man. It was all fun and games to me. But now as I'm getting older, I see how much darker this earth is getting. And that's why it's so much more important to go to church and to believe and have faith in Jesus Christ, because that's the only thing that'll get you through this dark world and the dark things we see. Sister Edna is talking about all the things that she sees in her environment. The only thing that will get her through with a cheerful attitude and upbeat is her belief and faith in Jesus Christ and that he is in control of all things. But Adam, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, he is seeing the evil of the world just accumulate and grow and grow. So you know what God does? God throws Adam a little blessing. He says, here's Enoch. Enoch, he's for 300 years, he walked with God. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that Enoch just thought about God. He philosophized about God. He talked about God. He didn't do that. That's what we do. He walked with God. He walked with God. Amos chapter 3, verse 3 says, how can two walk together unless they be agreed? That's the question. You can't. So Enoch and God were on the very same page. He was obedient to God. He was devoted to God. He was obedient to God. They were on the same page. He walked with him. And then God, took him. He took him. And there is a glimmer of hope that there is grace in the world. Adam, see that? Enoch, your great-great-great-great-grandson, he's gone. And where's he gone? He's gone to be with the Lord. In Jude, the book of Jude, verse 14, we see the prophecy of Enoch against false prophets. In other words, he was against lying false prophets and lying teachers. And his prophecy was that God would judge the unrighteous. He would judge their ungodly deeds. He would judge their words. And that, my friends, should be a comfort to you. And it's a judgment that comes straight from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the Messiah would deal the death blow to Satan. And this Messiah will come through the line of Seth, and he will come. He will come. He will not come at your timetable or during your time frame. He wouldn't come according to Eve's time frame or Adam's time frame. He'll come according to God's time frame. And he came about 4,000 years later. And he came and he was born in a manger, very unexpectedly. And he grew up to save all those that were chosen in him before the foundation of the world. So Enoch was thrown in there for Adam and others and for us. That shows even because God cursed man with death because of Adam's voluntary disobedience, there's actually victory over death. God is all powerful. And through Enoch showed us that there is hope. Hope even for us. So I'll end with this. The genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 shows us the cycle of salvation. We have Adam, and Adam's genealogy shows us the reign of death. Enoch shows us hope of life, and Noah shows us a new day and a new creation. So this story of redemption is simple. It's death, salvation by God, and then the new creation, which is heaven, where we will live forever and ever.